The first rule that needs to be considered when we're looking at the admissibility of evidence is whether or not the evidence is relevant. Now, the rule itself is contained in Section 55 of the Evidence Act. Let's take a look. Section 55, subsection 1. The evidence that is relevant in a proceeding is evidence that, if it were accepted, could rationally affect, directly or indirectly, the assessment of the probability of the existence of a fact in issue in the proceeding. Read that aloud just once, and you'll see that there are a lot of terms there that are heavily loaded and very potent, warranting further examination. That's not what we're going to do right now. For our purposes, we're focused on 3 words in particular. Fact in issue. Why? Well, let's start with an example. Meet Annabelle. She's looking a little nervous, isn't she? Well, that's because she's been charged with possession of a prohibited drug under Section 10 of the Drug Misuse and Trafficking Act. It's okay, Annabelle. We'll get back to you in a second. For now, let's take a look at the section itself, as this is the first step to determining whether or not any subsequent evidence to be admitted in court is relevant. The section reads pretty straightforward. Section 10, subsection 1. A person who has a prohibited drug in his or her possession is guilty of an offence. If we return to first principles that you would have covered in your criminal law classes, we know that certain things need to be proven against a person in order for the charge itself to be established. We can typically identify these elements by looking to the charge itself. Here, one such element is that it was in fact a prohibited drug that was in the possession of the person. But also we need to establish both the actus reus, that is physical element, and the mens rea, the mental element. With reference to the possession charge that Annabelle faces, we can see that the Crown needs to establish that she actually had physical possession of the prohibited drug, and although it's not explicitly stated in the legislation, that she had knowledge of this possession. That is, that she knew of its presence on her person. But Marco, I hear you say, you handsome idiot, we've already covered this in our first criminal law class. Why is it that we're covering it again in CPEP? It's because these principles provide the first steps to identifying a fact in issue. As facts in issue are determined with reference to both the charge being levied against an accused and the pleadings of the parties. So if we return to poor Annabelle, we need to see exactly what it is that the Crown alleges happened. Let's set the scene. Late night 6 months ago, a very busy nightclub, and we have Annabelle sitting at a bar enjoying a couple of drinks. 2 police officers conducting their general duties for this particular area enter. They scan the room, looking around to see any signs of suspicious activity. One of the officers notices Annabelle sitting all alone at the bar with her purse clutched very tightly on her lap. The officer later records in his police statement that she was looking rather suspicious. So the 2 officers make their way through the crowd and towards Annabelle. One of the officers speaks to Annabelle and explains the basis of his suspicion and the necessity for a search through her possessions. Annabelle reluctantly hands over her purse. And after a little ruffling through her possessions, what does the police officer find? A little baggie containing white powder. Annabelle accompanies the officers to the police station, where subsequent analysis reveals that the baggie actually contained 3.2 grams of cocaine. It is this sequence of events that gives rise to the Section 10 possession charge. So if we stop here for a moment, we can see what needs to be proven by the Crown. Firstly, that Annabelle was in possession of a prohibited drug, and secondly, that she had knowledge of this possession. What do we think is going to be the challenging issue here? We already know that it's a prohibited drug, as the analyses revealed as much. The evidence seems to suggest that Annabelle was indeed in possession of the drug. The police found it in her purse. But what about knowledge? Could Annabelle's knowledge of her possession of the drugs be a fact and issue? Well, let's take a look at what she's saying actually occurred. Now, Annabelle isn't contesting the fact that she was in the nightclub, the police approached her, searched her purse, and found something that was later determined to be cocaine. Instead, she is saying that she has absolutely no idea of how the cocaine came to be in her purse. So this is where we stand. The Crown is saying that she had the cocaine in her possession, and she knew she had it in her possession. And we have Annabelle saying, well, no, I had no idea of its existence whatsoever. Thus, we have our fact-in issue, what needs to be proven by the Crown. Consequently, in order for evidence to be relevant, it must have some bearing on the existence of this fact-in issue, by affecting the probability of its existence or non-existence. Now consider this. In preparing her defense, Annabelle managed to get a statement from the bartender that was working that night. The bartender remembers Annabelle, and indeed remembers serving her a few drinks. In fact, he remembers that about 20 minutes before the police entered, something happened involving Annabelle. He recalls seeing a gentleman approach Annabelle, and in his words, he looked kind of creepy. The gentleman started talking to Annabelle, but Annabelle didn't seem to be interested. The guy kept talking and talking and talking, to which Annabelle promptly turned her back to him. This guy, says the bartender, looked rather angry. However, instead of saying anything else to Annabelle, he moved towards her purse, hovered his hand over it, and seemed to drop something in there, which resembled a white bag. Now let's assume the bartender can give evidence of this in court. Would this account be relevant? Or, in simpler terms, could his evidence, if accepted, rationally affect the assessment of the probability of the existence of fact-in issue? Okay, that's not really much simpler. Does it go towards proving she did or didn't have knowledge of the drugs? Well, yes. If accepted, the evidence of the bartender provides an innocent explanation. That is, it was there because someone else planted it there, and she didn't know of its presence. Now let's change the facts a little. What if the bartender were to say exactly the same thing that he just did? But he adds that just before Annabelle turned her back towards the creepy guy, she handed him some money. If accepted, how could this evidence go towards establishing knowledge on the part of Annabelle? Or in other words, what could this evidence suggest? Now consider this. In addition to the evidence of that bartender, we actually have evidence from another bartender who was working that night. The evidence of this bartender states that the original bartender, who claims to have seen the interaction between Annabelle and the creepy man, can't be trusted, as it was she who was serving drinks to Annabelle that night, not the original bartender, and in fact, he was at the other side of the bar the entire time and couldn't have seen any interaction occurring. Is the evidence of this bartender relevant? Well, no. How does the evidence of this bartender, speaking in relation to the physical positioning of the other bartender, have any bearing on the fact-in issue of whether or not Annabelle knew that drugs were in her purse? It doesn't. In short, we look to the charge to determine what elements need to be proven. Depending on the pleadings of either party, we can extrapolate what is or are the facts in issue. And on the basis of this, we can determine whether or not the impugned evidence is in fact relevant.